Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Past It Classics live show. This month's book was Slaughterhouse-Five by Vonnegut. And sort of before we dive into things, I just wanted to give a quick trigger warning before Cara and Julia introduce themselves. So we have trigger warnings for war, death, PTSD, gore, grief, World War II, concentration camps and the Holocaust, graphic animal death, starvation, disease, and bombing. And with that, would you guys like to introduce yourselves?
On that note,
Yeah.
Sure. I'm Julia. My channel is called Shakespeare and Such, but you can more often find me on Instagram under the same name. I read a lot of historical leaning books. So classics, historical fiction, historical fantasy, historical romance. We love a historical time period in this house. But I do read quite a mix of things overall. And
Yeah, if you could also include your history with Vonnegut or like this book in general.
oh yeah, I know nothing about this man. I've experienced none of his works. When you say Vonnegut, I just think of Hardback Hoarder, and that's it. I know she reads Vonnegut. I'm like, okay.
And Cara?
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Cara. My channel is Wild Book Garden. My setup is not usually this precarious, so apologies for that. I read a lot of pretty much everything. I do read a lot of fantasy and historical books, but I also read a good bit of nonfiction. I read a lot of contemporaries, which I never thought would happen. Like, if you had told me just a few years ago that that would be a genre I read really often, I would not have believed you. So we love to see growth as a reader. And I'm also very passionate about reading all age ranges. I have like a whole book club about that. It's the Not a Genre Book Club. And yeah, that's something that's really important to me. And like, they're great books, so literally no downside. As far as my history with Vonnegut, I'm like real quick pulling up the bibliography page on Wikipedia because I think I have read like a single short story from him before, but I can't find
I know you have, because we talked about it at some point, the three of us, and I was like, that sounds wild. And I did not read the short story, but I read the synopsis of the short story.
Okay. Was it Harrison Bergeron? That's the one I always think is by him.
I don't know.
It actually is.
I don't know.
I'm looking it up now.
It was like a boy who was like 2 something.
It is, okay, it is by Vonnegut. I was right. That's always exciting. So I did not invent that. I had read one short story by him, which was Harrison Bergeron. And it's funny because my very vague general knowledge of like the kinds of things Vonnegut writes or wrote, I was like, oh, I don't like him. But the only thing I had read by him was Harrison Bergeron, which stands out as one of the only things I enjoyed in my high school English classes. Like, I actually think it's a better dystopian than 1984, or than what's the other famous one?
Shots fired. Brave New World.
I was going to say, don't you dare say Fahrenheit 451. You can slander Brave New World.
Fahrenheit 451 is better, but yeah. So I've read that. That's the only experience I had prior to this book, and I only knew very vaguely some things about his life, which I had to like fact check as I was reading, so I don't think it counts. So yeah.
Nice. And I'm Taylor from Page Screen Taylor. You are on my channel. I usually read romance, sci-fi, fantasy, classics, and sometimes I'll dabble in nonfiction or mysteries, thrillers, but I usually stick to like romance and women's lit nowadays. And almost 10 years ago, like I think we're 10 years 10 years ago, I read Cat's Cradle for my freshman year English class by Vonnegut, and I really, really enjoyed it. I remember almost nothing about the book other than Ice 9, but I really enjoyed like his style of writing, how like weird it was, how like imaginative it was. So I've never read Slaughterhouse-Five. I had no idea what it was about until I started reading it. But yeah, I'd only read one book by him. And with that, why don't we go into our ratings?
Tara.
I honestly have no idea how the split is gonna go for some of it. Like, I think I know
I don't
what
know
Julia
either.
thought. Okay, so I gave it a 3-star, but it's one of those 3 stars where it's like, it's not because the book felt mediocre. It was like some parts I think were incredibly interesting and profound, and then some parts I'm like, why? Like, why did you do this? Like, I think that it is one of the only like serious man literature books I have read that actually I think effectively uses like a disjointed style. Like, I feel like that's something that a lot of times authors can use, and it kind of like hides deficiencies in like writing or plot. And
Yeah.
I feel like this is one of the only times that like it truly made sense for the story, and I think it served the story, and I think it still had emotional impact in places. And I also think this is one of the only stories I've read where I'm not even sure how to articulate it, but like the desensitizing of violence and of horrible things is brushed off in the story, and that's the point, and the reader understands that that's wrong, that's horrible, you know, because I think sometimes authors think they're doing commentary and they're not, you know, and this actually to me felt like it was, like, even though it was a very convoluted, in a lot of ways, very disjointed, like, I think reading it and also knowing that Kurt Vonnegut himself was in the bombing of Dresden, I'm like, I can see, especially with that lens, that this is an anti-war novel. But all that being said, I think it could have been even more effective at what it was if it had just used, I don't know, if it had been just a little more pointed with the parts that were already successful. I don't know if any of those words made sense together, but like,
No, I get what you're saying.
like the alien thing, I'm like, why did we need? I don't know. I think like the alien part, I understand that we're supposed to be confused about how much of this is real, and is he, you know, is this all PTSD? Is this all mental illness? Or, you know, at some point that did he actually get caught by aliens? But I still think that there are things about the way the sci-fi thing was used in the book that sort of like lessened the impact of it as an anti-war novel. So have fun picking that apart to get my thoughts. I'm like, I don't know,
man. Julia?
So I agree with a fair bit of what Cara said. I actually, sorry guys, I gave it 2.5 stars, technically 2.4. And it's such a weird reading experience because on an objective level, I think the writing itself was actually quite good. Like, I saved so many quotes. I think there was such like visceral use of language that I would be like, oh, that's nasty. Like, it got a reaction out of me. Like, it was effective writing. But I think the actual craft of the whole novel was not effective at all to me. So it was like, stylistically, no. Writing, amazing. So it was a very like jarring experience for me. And I also, it's hard because I know that's like the point is that the style is supposed to feel disjointed and disconnected. And even that quote at the beginning that I referenced in my review of like, what did I even say? You know, it's so short and jumbled and jangled because there's nothing intelligent to say about a massacre. Like, totally get it, 100%. But on the same hand, I personally can't love the experience of reading a book where I don't connect to, enjoy, like, or care about a single character. I'm just no one. Sorry. So So it was hard for me, even though like when I was reading it, it didn't feel like a slog. Like I would read it so much faster than I would think. But then I just didn't care. I'm not making sense. And I also personally did not feel like I understood that it was an anti-war book. Like I got that impression of like he's trying to say things that he's against war, but I didn't actually get that message like strongly.
Yeah, like it was like anti-war in the way that like I think one of his big points that I got from the book at least was like like the quote you shared, Julia, it's like a massacre is senseless, war is senseless. And so the fact that this book feels just like a pile of vignettes and bad things happening, and like there's not really a through line, and there isn't really this big realization at the end, like you were saying, is like I think that is very intentional. I think it is well executed as far as that goes, but I can't help thinking it would have been an even more effective anti-war novel if he had had more of those moments that we were allowed to have like emotion, like because there were even some parts where the characters had been through so much that they just sort of couldn't take anymore, and it was just like, oh look, you know, horrible, like atrocities happening on all sides of me, and they just kind of like don't do anything because they're overwhelmed with it. And there were parts of that where, as you said, Julia, the language is so precise that it's like I had a reaction even if the characters weren't, which was great. And I think if that had happened more consistently, I think it could have kept the unique style but also been more successful as a whole. So I get it.
Interesting. Well,
Yeah, sorry.
I'm giving this book 4 out of 5 stars.
Wow, that's
I really liked it. A lot of the disjointed narrative made sense for me. I also had similar concerns as you, Julia, about the lack of characters to sort of latch onto, because that's a big thing for me. But there is a quote later in the book that mentions like war has no characters. It turns like everyone into like the same person, sort of. You're not allowed to be individuals. So I think that sort of fixed it for me. But there was something just, I don't know. It wasn't like any anti-war book I had ever read before, which usually just tells you point blank, these are the terrible things that are happening. I'm thinking of All Quiet on the Western Front, which I
was thinking of that one. Yeah,
I also really enjoyed. But this one, having it all so disjointed and disconnected, and you're reading both during the war and after the war and before the war, and how all of this sort of like meshes together, and this idea of all moments of your life happening at the same time. I don't know if you've ever read Story of Your Life or seen the movie Arrival.
I've seen part of Arrival. Yeah.
Yeah, in that one, the aliens there have a concept of time that works very differently from humans, which I I love when stuff like that happens. Like, you are both alive and dead. You are also unborn. I don't know. I'm such a sucker for that sort of messing with time and the timeline sort of thing. I don't know if I'm making any sense.
No, I get what you mean.
Yeah. And I mean, to be fair, Kurt Vonnegut is a little freak, and you know I love little freaks. I was like doing like research and like looking up book club questions as like a sort of jumping off point, and so many of them had, do you think Kurt Vonnegut was high when he wrote this?
Weirdly, I don't get that vibe.
Yeah. Cat's Cradle, I would say he probably was very high.
That would be a fun like challenge question, is like you read multiple things by an author and you're like, which of these did they write under the influence?
Yeah. Absolutely just high.
Yeah, stoned out of their mind. Yeah.
But we can move on to the questions that I have.
Yeah, this is going to be a juicy one. I love when we're divided.
I know. I think we have like a award category on our classes, like most divisive.
Yeah.
Might be in the running for it.
You are for sure in the running.
I feel like most of the ones, like this year, we've had a couple of like real duds.
Some stinkers.
Yeah.
My sister has a copy of 100 Years of Solitude in her room, and I almost started hissing at it when I saw
it. Get it away.
No.
Triggers your fight or flight response.
Yeah.
I guess it's good that we started with that because everything else will be amazing in comparison.
It's all uphill from here. Yeah. Yeah. It's like Dr. Thorne was a slog, but I'm like, at least there wasn't any incest in it.
At least you can say that.
Yeah. The bar is on the ground.
Small victories.
So, I wanted to talk about the characters, and well, Julie and I mentioned earlier there aren't very many characters, but I wanted to discuss Billy Pilgrim first of all. Like, what did you think of him as a narrator, reading the war through his eyes, how he is in his childhood, during the war, after the war, stuff like that?
He sure was there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Someone else take it away because this is not.
Yeah, like it was weird. Like I had almost no information about him, no emotions about him. I did appreciate that one of the only things we do seem to know about him is that he has a pretty strong sense of ethics. And seeing him try to like hold on to that in the face of these horrible things and in the face of like this absolutely nonsensical violence, you know. I admired that. But like other than that, I don't really feel like he had a personality, and I don't even know that this isn't one of those other things we were talking about where it's like I think that is the point. Like he's an everyman, and like the quotes you guys were sharing, it's like, you know, war means nobody's a character, they're all just the same. So like I get that, and it worked in some places, but also I think this could have been an even more effective story if he was more of like a presence in the book. Yeah, like it really, I feel like Billy Pilgrim was like a vehicle for like the writing style, and again it served the story, but it wasn't like a protagonist that I had a lot of personal attachment to. Like I cared about the things that were happening because they were, you know, monstrous. But I didn't have like a personal attachment to the characters, and even the characters themselves also didn't have personal attachments to each other, which again is part of like PTSD and war and all of that. But yeah, one big point in Kurt Vonnegut's favor is I think this is one of the only classics I have ever read by a man where the book explicitly says they did not have sex until she asked him.
Yeah.
I was like, good for you, man. Like that, the fact that that is so rare, yeah. The fact that is so rare is depressing. But like as soon as they were like, oh, and they brought in like a woman as a mate for him, I was like, uh-oh. And then Billy like absolutely left her alone. Like didn't even like hit on her basically until in like a week she's like, okay, we can sleep together now, which kind of wild, doesn't really make sense. But at least there was consent.
It took her a week to get used to her human zoo situation.
She's
very adaptable.
Yeah. I hate it here. Yeah, so I'm putting my hater hat on for a minute. So the thing with Billy is that, okay, like I understand the quote of like, you know, the war doesn't, you know, allow individuality, so there are no characters. But I think when you're telling a story, the point is to have a character to follow. Because if it's not a story, then you're just recounting events. And that is not as effective to me. Like I would have liked to fear for Billy, or I would have liked to felt any emotion for Billy, frankly. And instead it was just like, well, And maybe some of that isn't even his fault. Maybe some of that is the fact that we're time traveling. So in any time when there was like a danger, I was like, doesn't matter. He's going to get poofed away right before X happens. And then he would. And then he'd be in the human zoo, or he'd be a child, or he'd be whatever. And so like, to me, I was like, I feel like there's no stakes because of that. So I guess that's not really a Billy thing. So I'll take it off the Billy thing. I'll move it over to storytelling. But the reason I actually don't like Billy, which is funny, Cara, because you're like, wow, the bar is on the floor. I actually think he had an abysmal opinion of all women, and he grossed me the heck out, actually. Like, I thought he was shitty to his daughter, to his mom, to his wife, to his space mate. Just even though, like, yay, like, you had sex once she said it was okay. But you're also, like, cognizantly still a married man, aren't you? Like, I don't know, even though you're trapped in the alien suit, like, he aggravated me. And I couldn't get over that. I was like, we get crumbs of females in this book, and every single one is written like this and treated like this. Ugh.
I think, like, I was benefited by the fact that, like, my expectations were, like, on the floor. Like, I hated 1984, and one of the things I hated is the single female character we get and how she's written. And so, like, in comparison, it being not quite as bad, I was like, wow! Like, not that that's, like, amazing. But, like, yeah, I also, the one that stood out to me the most is the way that he thought and talked to his wife. I really didn't like. So yeah, I definitely don't think Billy Pilgrim is like proto-feminist. We love, you know, no. So yeah, I see what you mean, Julia. I get it.
There is this element of Billy going through the motions because he knows, like, this is going to happen anyway. There's no point in changing it, which is, I think, a running theme in Kurt Vonnegut books. At least it was a big one in Cat's Cradle, from what I understand, is just sort of like knowing what's going to happen and not really like doing anything to change it.
Yeah, like inevitability.
Yes, yeah. So for me, Billy Pilgrim was like also like he's not going to go down as one of my favorite characters ever. But there was something about using him as his vessel to tell this story, someone who is an everyman, someone who after the war goes through the motions and goes through life sort of not really making his own decisions and not like really like, I guess, having his own agency because something like that was stripped from him in the war. So, you know, he marries his wife and they're going to have a good marriage, not a great marriage. And he's like fine with that because he's just going through the motions. He's an optometrist. He's going through the motions. And it felt a lot like it reflected on like just war survivors, I guess. Like a lot of them just do try to pick up life as normal and they just go through it.
Yeah.
As far as his treatment of women, I think Kurt Vonnegut just writes women in a weird way.
He does. Why? Okay, why is the only thing we know about his wife that she's fat?
Truly the only
thing.
You forgot that she eats chocolate.
I would categorize that under category A of being fat. Okay.
Yeah. Literally, all I thought was like, this woman has terrible taste in candy.
Some of them are like these old. I'm like, I don't think they sell these anymore.
Yeah, like
I thought they were made up chocolate bars.
And I will say, like, the lack of women didn't necessarily bother me because it does feel like, as of that time, like a very male story. And like,
I didn't anticipate a lot because I was like, it's the war. We're not going to have a lot of girls around.
Yeah. And it's, for the most part, an experience that was solely male. This idea that you go off to war, you're drafted in war, and then you have to come back and resume life as usual, while people who, you know, women couldn't fight in the war. Like, there were a few, but, like, for the most part, they couldn't. There's no way for them to understand how he is. That being said, I do agree that there weren't at least any sort of female characters that stood out to me or that I felt were important to the plot. And honestly, I just kind of wish Kurt Vonnegut didn't include women. I'd much prefer that.
It is one of those cases where it's like we'd be better off with it.
Like just don't try.
It's fine. It's fine, baby. Just put down the pencil.
Yeah, just stick to the dudes.
Stick to the dudes.
Yeah. I also like what you guys were saying about inevitability being like a really huge sort of like theme or motif in the book. I think it's really interesting because I guess this is sort of in the defense of like the random sci-fi element, even though I'm still not completely sold on it. Like everything they start telling us about like the Trafalgamorians or whatever, I'm like, please no. But there were some moments that I'm like, okay, this is really good commentary. Like this is really interesting. Like even beyond just like the human zoo thing, which I think was like, very smartly written. There were moments in those parts that I'm like, okay, I can kind of understand why this kind of bizarre alien space plot would be like a good vehicle for this, because there's like that moment where Billy says that he learns, like he's like, oh, you guys don't hurt each other, like there's no like violence here, there's no war. He's like, I want to learn that and take it back with me. And they're like, oh no, we like kill each other all the time, it's just like not happening right now. And he's like, well, you could do something about it. And they're like, no, we can't. Like, so the inevitability thing, and also like the fact that living your life as if all the moments are happening at once, it is freeing in a way. Like Billy, feeling like, oh, I'm not really gonna die because nobody ever really dies. Like there is that sort of freeing element, but also it sort of like traps you into not doing anything. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the interesting things about that is that like up to this point, Billy has also been feeling really like nothing matters. It doesn't matter what I do. This is all going to happen. I can't stop it. I can't change it. Like, yes, this is horrible that these people are dying right next to me, but it was always going to happen. I can't do anything. And then he gets sort of like faced with that argument from someone else. And he's like, no, that's wrong. Like, you can't just give up. You can't just say like, it doesn't matter if we destroy the universe because we know it's always going to happen that way. And so I think it's interesting that like, a book that does have so much discussion of inevitability and kind of suggesting like free will isn't, real, or it's not really like a consideration. There's even a line about how like only humans could come up with a concept like free will. So there's all of this stuff that is sort of arguing in favor of it doesn't matter. Like there's no point in trying to fix anything. But there are those little moments that Billy has where he's like, I can't let that happen. Like maybe it's stupid, but I kind of like deep down, I want to believe that like you can do something about it. I don't know if this is still on topic of like Billy as a main character.
Yeah, I would say it is.
It's like those were moments where I'm like, okay, I do have like a couple feelings about you, Billy.
I straight up don't remember these moments. Like genuinely, can you like specify one?
Oh, I wasn't really great like about noting when. Like I only have a couple quotes saved because I read it as an ebook from my library because I thought I had, and I was like, I don't think I'm gonna want to keep this one, which was a good move. But yeah, so I think it's near the middle. I wonder if I can find it while we're talking. Maybe I'll see if I can find that part because it's in like the zoo section, and I feel like it's near the middle of the book. So I'll look for that while you guys discuss.
Okay, thanks.
So, while Kara's looking for that, we don't have like basically any other characters, but I did want to discuss like the narrator in the beginning of the book, who I could be wrong, but I feel like we're meant to understand that's Kurt Vonnegut himself.
That's how I interpreted it, kind of.
Yeah, but I wanted to know if you had any opinions on that, like framing device, or was it worth it? Was it not?
There were some good quotes in it, so I guess it was worth it.
I will say I do love this long title.
Oh my god, ridiculous. But so is the rest of the book, so I guess he's allowed that.
Hi, Kier.
It's gonna be a wild time.
You
here.
came for the ride.
Yeah, and what a ride it will be. Buckle that seatbelt. Sorry, now I'm just looking at the title. Oh boy. That's fun.
Oh, okay. I think.
Did you have it?
Okay, I think I did find part of it. Of course, it's split up in different sections because everything is like
That's okay.
a vignette of a few paragraphs. But so a Tralfamadorian test pilot presses a starter button and the whole universe disappears. So it goes. If you know this, said Billy, isn't there some way you can prevent it? Can't you keep the pilot from pressing the button? He has always pressed it, and he always will. We always let him, and we always will let him. The moment is structured that way. So, said Billy gropingly, I suppose that the idea of preventing war on Earth is stupid too. Of course. But you do have a peaceful planet here. Today we do. On other days we have wars as horrible as any you've ever seen or read about. There isn't anything we can do about them, so we simply don't look at them. We ignore them. We spend eternity looking at pleasant moments, like today at the zoo. Isn't this a nice moment? Yes. That's one thing Earthlings might learn to do if they tried hard enough. Ignore the awful times and concentrate on the good ones. Said Billy Pilgrim. And then I think there's another part of that conversation that I'm going to try to find. It would sure be nice if this were in some kind of order. Where is the next alien part? Da, da, da. Okay, maybe it's in a different part, but that was one of the things that I was talking about, where it's like, you know, we're pretty far into the book at this point. Billy's character, such as it is, has kind of been arguing on the side of like, it doesn't matter, you can't do anything about it. But then when somebody else says that, he's like, I don't like that. No, that doesn't seem.
But it is.
Right.
But it is more of a mindset thing. Like he's saying more like, oh yeah, focus on the good, not like, oh yeah, we can actively try to change things for the better. It's more just like, but let's enjoy the good things is kind of how I read that. It was like
the aliens. But like, I think, oh, that's interesting. Because I was taking it more as like, because they say that like there's no point trying, that like they're not going to try and stop this from happening because it doesn't matter. So even if it is like, they do say let's focus on the good stuff, to me that mindset is separate from it doesn't matter if we would try to stop bad things from happening. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. So something about that quote that I think resonated with me is also, I guess, even though, like, as far as I know, none of us have been in war, but let's just say the average layman who hasn't been in war, it's so easy for them to like ignore war and like focus on the good things and not focus on like, how did this come about? What can I do to stop it? It's just, well, it happened and that's just how it is.
Yeah, I agree.
It's such a weird but interesting role that the aliens do play in this book, because I feel like on the one hand, without their interference, excuse me, like Billy would be such a different character. Like he wouldn't have the same reactions to things if he didn't have like, you know, this knowledge of like inevitability pieces and sort of the wisdom of like death is a part of life, but it's not the end of life necessarily, right? Like, so like in that sense, like they're very impactful on him. I forgot the other thing I was going to say, which is really annoying to me. Great. Love that. Taylor, what did you say before I started talking?
Well, like this idea that I think a lot of people tend to have like approaching wars that maybe they're not even in, but just like, well, this is just how it's always been. People have always been at war. There's nothing I can do to stop it. And I think there's simultaneously that feeling of helplessness in that, like, what can I do to stop this war? There's nothing I can do. And also could refer to like ambivalence as well. Like, well, there's nothing I can do about it. People are going to die. This is just going to happen. So it goes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I totally don't know what I was going to say, but I stand by what I say in that I do think they play an interesting and weird role in this book.
Yeah, I actually would like to talk about the Trafalmadorians, and I was trying to do research, but I couldn't find anything about if the Trafalmadorians were like related at all to like Trafalgar Square, which I think the protest happened at.
I don't know.
Yeah. Sorry, I realized, Taylor, I didn't answer like your previous question about the narrator.
Oh,
honestly,
sorry.
the narrator. No, it's fine because I got so deep into what we were talking about. Honestly, the only thought I had about the narrative device, I was like, you confuse me. Like, what is? Like, I got so confused about like, okay, wait, so is like this narrator telling us about an anti-war book that he wrote, and that anti-war book is the story of Billy Pilgrim, or is there like another layer? Like, I don't know. Apparently I can handle like Victorian frame narratives, no problem. It's like, oh, you wrote this entire like family's life story in a letter and now you're telling me about it, that's fine. But like apparently like modern classic frame narratives, I'm like, I don't understand.
What was it, Wuthering Heights, when the servant just held some guy at hostage and told him the whole story?
And it was so long. Like, he was like, hey, what's up with the neighbors? And she like drops this like this like stack of paper, and she's like, here is the history of my life, their life, their children's lives, the village. Like,
she's like, I've been waiting for somebody to ask me this question for 50
this guy's like
years.
inching towards the door, and she's like, wait, there's more.
And then I also wanted to say, Taylor, that I really liked that you brought up the ability to ignore war, because I think that is like a big part of this story as well. And one of the things that stood out to me about that specifically was also like the way that like people in charge, or the people who are making these big decisions about like, yeah, let's like bomb this city. It's not only that they can ignore the like immediacy of the consequences, but it's the way that they like calculate, and they're like, well, we're trying to end the war, and so if we like break the spirit of the civilians by bombing the shit out of them, then that's, in the long run, that's good, you know? And I feel like one of the things that this book is saying is that like that's too easy. Like, not that you don't, not that there's a way to avoid making decisions like that in war. And I think it's, you know, the fact that it's World War II and like they are fighting against Nazism and genocide and all of these things that truly do kill that many people. So it's like, I don't think the book is saying you can just avoid all those hard choices, but I feel like one of the things it is saying is like, you don't get off the hook by just saying, well, mathematically it made sense. Like, I could not believe that the bombing of Dresden killed more people than the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. I didn't know that. I didn't know anything about the bombing of Dresden. And obviously not to undercut how horrible the atomic bombs were, because they were and are. But yeah, like that really stood out to me in this book is, and I think that's one of the things that like, even though there were parts of the storytelling that I don't think were as effective, the moments that were really got me. Like, even like that section from like the Nazi collaborator where he's talking about how America hates poor people. I'm like, oh, this is some good commentary, because like he's kind of right, like about some of it. I mean, like obviously he's a despicable human being, but like the things that he's saying about like there is this weird like self-hatred that American capitalism thrives on, you know?
Yeah.
So anyway, I got kind of off track there, but I really like that you said that, Taylor.
No, that was like very interesting. Especially when you brought up the like American Nazi who was like comically American. Didn't he have like cowboy boots and maybe I
Yeah.
imagined it, but a 10-gallon hat with like a
No, he
swastika
did.
on
He
it.
did have a 10 gun.
Yeah, I think it was like red, white, and blue, but
Yeah.
with a swastika.
Yeah.
Yep.
That was interesting.
Hooey.
So I wanted to talk about the Trafalmadorians and why, like, what do you think about their purpose in the story? Why do you think they were included? And also, do you
So we
think
could time travel.
and do you think they're metaphorical or real? I know that's a lot of questions in one question.
I mean,
No pressure to answer all of them.
okay, I'll start off. I took them literally. I was like, sure thing, aliens. Because if you think about it, there's that scene, that weird old scene towards the end of the book when he's in like the sex shop, looking at sci-fi novels, and they're like, "You freak, you little pervert, looking at the sci-fi
Like,
books."
why can't you buy porn like a normal person?
And there's like that newspaper article that's like, this movie star's missing and we don't know what happened to her. I'm like, she's not on this planet, my friends. So I took it literally. What that means in terms of the narrative, you tell me. But I truly believe that fictional Billy Pilgrim did get abducted by real fictional aliens.
That is fascinating because I took that same scene as a confirmation that it was not real because because when he's in the checkout line and he sees that like tabloid that's like whatever happened to like Montana so and so.
Yeah, Hannah Montana.
Like that, and there's a couple other little things like where he's like looking at the back of the sci-fi novel and it's almost the human zoo thing or like that is part of it. I took that to mean like, okay, so he's picking up things from the world around him and using it to make sense of his trauma and like trying to come up with an explanation for why he feels so like disjointed in time and everything. Which I don't know when PTSD was officially considered a diagnosis, but probably
Not at this time.
Okay, thank you, Taylor, our fact checker. So like I think that's really interesting, but I'm not completely sold that it's not real because like for most of the book I was thinking it probably was. I was like, obviously there is some metaphorical, layers to how all of these things can be interpreted through the lens of mental illness, but I was thinking it was probably true. And then at the end we get sort of a few of those little things in a row, and also because the tabloid, they make it sound like she's not just missing, but she's like presumed dead, which I guess also could still support her being in space.
But it sounds like it's very like National Enquirer, like
yes, oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. These are like trashy tabloids. So anyway,
she was
I find
also
that
like
so interesting.
Porn star, which I assume like wasn't the safest job in
True.
the 60s.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Cara.
No. I think that was it. I find it so cool and interesting that like Julie and I have like opposite interpretations of that scene.
Okay, I have two follow-ups. One, they wouldn't have called it PTSD, but they might have been like, oh, he's a shell-shocked soldier. Yeah. So they would have recognized that like something from war had affected him, but they probably wouldn't have had much insight. But then, okay, my follow-up question for you, Cara, is if the aliens are figurative, then is he like mentally traveling through time and like that's a coping mechanism, or do you think there's still a sci-fi element that just isn't aliens? Like, what's your interpretation there?
I guess I was sort of thinking of it as like all or nothing, like either the aliens and the time travel are true or neither of them are. And like I said, it's not like I finished the book and I'm like, oh, it was all fake, he's just ill and he needs help. But I do think it's interesting that we have that's like some of the last things that happen in the book is we're seeing that there's at least a possibility that he could be incorporating things into whatever is going on with his mental health. And it makes me curious, like, about, I mean, there are some like disorders or I guess like mental like differences that have some pretty wild like side effects, or I don't know, like the traveling in time thing. It wouldn't surprise me if that was like a real symptom that you can have. I mean, even if he had just like a regular old brain injury, you know, on top of the fact that he is absolutely traumatized.
Yeah, I felt like the traveling through time was, so I'm actually in between you guys. I go back and forth between if it's real or not.
Yeah.
And I am still not entirely sure, because I do think elements of the book just couldn't happen if the aliens weren't real. But then there are things like you said, Cara, with the missing porn star, and there's like this other part where I think if it was like another soldier was like beaten by a German soldier, and he says, why me? And the German says, why anybody? And the Trafalgan say the same thing to Billy when he's picked up as well. So I started to wonder if that was him just transferring those memories into something that's otherworldly, because you can't imagine.
And it's kind of like the nonsensicalness of war is like, well, the only way to make sense of it is like aliens, you know, and time travel. Like that would sort of like make sense. Yeah, sorry, I think I cut you off, Taylor. I got excited about what you were saying.
No, it's fine. My other thinking was like, maybe the traveling through time is also supposed to be like, you know how people who have PTSD will sometimes flash back to when they're in the war and like remember certain parts. And I wonder if part of that is like what we think of as him traveling through time. It wouldn't really explain the future stuff, which is
I was gonna say, I've got a counter argument.
It's why I'm also like, I don't know entirely, but at least with the flashbacks, I can sort of see that as like flashing back through the war.
Yeah, it's funny because I am almost always, when there's a story that's like, is it real? Is it made up? Who knows? I am almost always on the side of like, yes, it's real. Otherwise, the story is not as interesting and doesn't make sense. So it's really unusual that on this one, I'm a little more split. Yeah. And it is interesting that we have like the Flash future stuff, because I think that could suggest any number of things. Like it could be, like you were saying, Taylor and Julia, like it could be that that suggests that the time travel is perhaps real because he is seeing things that have not happened yet. Or it could be a part of his mental illness. Or it could be something where like we kind of only, like Billy Pilgrim, obviously unreliable narrator in so many ways, because we don't even know how much of this happened. Although not the war parts. And I think that was a good move on the author's part, is that I don't ever get the feeling that that was supposed to be in question.
Yeah.
Which, like I said, I appreciate. But like, we only really have the word of our narrator or main character that the present day is the part where Billy is older, but before he goes on these like speaking tours and everything. So the fact that he's like, oh, I can foretell my death and everything, we don't know necessarily that that is the way that he dies, or that that is the way that things happen in the future. Or it could be that like we're seeing him at the end of his life and he's thinking that he's like in, you know, his late middle age or whatever.
Wow.
He's actually older than that. So I don't know.
Interesting.
I'd also like, I don't know.
I would love to point out Julia's cover, which has an image of the Trafalmadorians, which I really like. Oh, that's the bird. There we go.
That's a bird. It's really giving, you know, that like TikTok sound that's like, oh, there's a bit of pomegranate in it. No, it's not pomegranate. Try again. Oh, grapefruit. Yes, that's right.
I've never heard that sound.
That's a bird. Ooh, there you go.
Really cool art. So we actually already answered a few of these questions, so thank you guys.
Well, here, I'm gonna make a side note because I remembered something that has nothing to do with the current question at hand. But Cara, when you mentioned like but like we the reader collectively, like yes, we can argue or debate or have different degrees of belief about the aliens, but I very much interpreted everything in the real world as like, this really happened.
Mm-hmm.
That's a true thing that occurred in Billy Pilgrim's life, whether it's occurring right now or it is a flashback, who's to say. But it reminded me again, I shouldn't have been concerned about him cheating on his wife because he already cheated on his wife almost at that optometrist party.
Oh,
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry.
yeah.
I just remembered another reason why I was like, Billy, come on.
No, it's true.
That one I feel like is inexcusable because, like, if he's like kidnapped by aliens miles away and he doesn't know if he's going back to his wife, I feel like he got a pass from me on that because I'm like, to be fair, he doesn't know when he's coming back or if he's coming back.
Yeah.
Well, and aliens put you in the zoo with a mate. If I don't mate, are you going to kill me? Like, what are the stakes here?
And also, it's like, if they're light years away, his wife probably isn't alive anymore. You know, like, so yeah, I agree, Taylor. I think there are sort of various extenuating circumstances that could explain that one, but not the optometrist party. Like,
no.
Yeah. And
I really didn't
side
like
note,
the stories.
If any real aliens are watching this in real life, I'm very afraid of you. Please never abduct me. It's like, I don't think you guys understand. My dad, when I was growing up, he watched The Twilight Zone and The X-Files. And so I have a very strong, I think deeply rooted and reasonable fear of all aliens.
Yeah.
I remember my grandparents growing up had like a bunch of like, you know, the tapes, the tiny little tapes that you would put in the VHS to play.
Yeah.
They had a bunch of those, and my cousin and I were going through them. And he was like, "Oh, this one's about aliens." And I'm like, "What's an alien?" And he was like, "A monster from space that'll come down and it's going to kidnap you and eat you." And I remember running to my parents like, "What?"
Oh my gosh. Not phrasing it in the future tense, like it will come down from space.
And it will get you specifically.
Yeah. That's so horrifying. Like if a kid asks me like, what's a zombie? I'm like, well, in stories, people say a zombie is a dead person who comes back alive again. Like I would never be like, it's a person who dies and then they're going to come back and eat your brain.
Eat your brain. Yeah.
Better run.
Yeah. Oh,
I feel like it was like a cousin prank, but I think I took it way more seriously than he
I mean, when you're little, yeah, it's like, yeah. I also like, I just really didn't like the way the story treated his wife, and like, the things that happened to her. Like, okay, I find it so incredibly sad that she loves Billy so much and he just like tolerates her continued existence. And when he's in the hospital and she like drives to get there and then she dies horribly right as she gets there, and it's like, I think again, this is one of those things where it's like, I understand that it fits the themes of the book about like death is horrible and also like not pointless, but it's like it just happens and that sucks and you have to just sort of accept it. So I get that, but I also hate that it happened to this poor woman who has already gone through so much. Like,
yeah. I feel like I am of two minds in that I feel like it's the story and Kurt treating the wife like terribly, because if it was just Billy coming home and marrying this woman and realizing that all of the things that she finds important are silly compared to like what he's seeing and he's just tolerating it, or he feels like very numb towards her, that is understandable. But on top of that, with the narration constantly like fat shaming her, and she's always got some nasty chocolate in her hands.
I mean, this disgusting woman who's always eating in front of people.
Yeah. How dare you? How dare you enjoy candy?
Yeah, and
like a monster.
I feel like stuff like that does sort of, it's probably why I didn't give it 5 stars, because like, I don't know, I feel like they could have done more with her in the narrative while still making her someone that Billy is ambivalent towards or doesn't feel much towards or finds silly. Like there was that scene with the barbershop quartet at his anniversary party, and he like has this sort of it's a flash forward for him, but you know, he has some sort of reaction to it, and his wife is like freaking out at first, and then he gives her like this really nice ring and she starts showing it off. And I think that could have been a great way to like show like he's having these flashbacks and nothing about this is important, but you know, his wife, who was lucky enough to not deal with that, like there's no way to understand. But I think I told you Kurt Vonnegut has a way of writing women.
Yeah. And the fact too that it's like the only like scenes we get with the wife are like, I think sympathetic towards, like, or I mean, I feel sympathetic towards her. Like one of the only things we see her do is that she like breaks down crying because she thought nobody would ever marry her.
Yeah.
Because she's fat, as we are told over and over. And I like, that is so sad. And again, I find that extra sad in the way that like she loves Billy so desperately and he's like, I guess I'm married. Yeah. Like
yeah, no, it's almost worse to me in that he was like, well, I've seen our future and our marriage is all right, so sure, I'll go through with it. And it's like, okay, but maybe this woman who loves you so much deserves like to be really loved in return. And also like she's a human being, so she's worthy of more than just like being tolerated by the person she marries. Like, I don't know, like call me crazy.
Yeah, I do wish, what was her name? Monica?
Valencia.
I don't know where I got Monica from.
Did I make that up? Is that her name? I know of
Valencia. Which is a really pretty name, by the way.
Yeah.
It is. It really is.
That's my friend's fiance's name, and I'm like, beautiful name.
Ooh. It's fancy. Okay. So I sort of wanted to talk about what you think the significance of the phrase "so it goes" means, or why you think it's repeated throughout the book.
Yeah, I feel like we sort of touched on it with a lot of the other like thematic discussion where it's like the numbness of people in general, and especially people who have been through the things that Billy Pilgrim has. The fact that like at some point your empathy gets like exhausted, you know, because you're seeing just horrors all the time. And so it's not that you don't care, but it's like you sort of temporarily like switch off caring almost, like and I feel like the repetition of "so it goes," it sort of works on multiple levels because it's always used after something that is horrendous, you know, like it's always used after these like horrible tragedies and these horrible things that happen. And I think that is like, well, it's obviously very intentional because the reader is not supposed to take it as these things don't matter. I think we're supposed to see like the horrible things happen, and then the additional horror on top of that is that like these people have suffered and seen so much that they can't even react like people would, you know, like they normally would. Julia, sorry.
I'm sorry, I'm really going to take the seriousness down a notch, but no, it's not always terrible. I think once there was a line about batteries dying, and he went, "So it goes."
Oh, okay.
It was very funny.
For the most part, it was after, like,
yes.
Yeah.
I do also think there's another angle about it that I really enjoyed. Whoa, I enjoyed it. Where I feel like "so it goes" really encapsulated like the absurdity of death.
Yes.
In that, you know, you can survive a plane crash and then die of carbon monoxide poisoning en route to the hospital, right? Like those instances where it's like, yeah, like, you know, it's very Hamilton, death doesn't discriminate, right? Like, and that is a part of life, whether it's death in war or civilian life or past or present or future. Death always comes in very strange and unexpected and sometimes grotesque and sometimes almost comedic ways. And, you know, just like, so it goes, like that is just how it is.
Yeah. And I feel like, oh, sorry, go ahead, Karen.
Sorry. Kind of like the part I was talking about earlier, where like he's in the human zoo with the aliens, and he's sort of like forced to confront his own sort of philosophy of like, you can't do anything, you can't change it, so it doesn't matter. Similarly to that, I almost feel like there's a way that the repetition of So It Goes, it almost functions as like the narrator or Billy trying deliberately to like numb themselves, and they can't all the way. It's like, I don't know, it's weird to say it's like a hopeful thing, but it's like so much of the book is kind of suggesting that, you know, like humans' capacity for compassion is finite, and that nothing you can do about it. That's just, you know, so it goes. That's just the way it is. And I sort of feel like the sheer number of times that So It Goes is used, and the way that it is often used with these atrocious things that the characters are still recognizing as being horrible, it almost contradicts itself a little bit. And I think that is really, really interesting, that the very fact that you have to keep reminding yourself that's just the way things are, it kind of suggests that there's a part of you that doesn't believe that, or that believes that shouldn't be the way, you know. It's like a, I don't know, contradictory almost.
Yeah. No, I like that.
And it can almost be
I'm jet lagged.
Like in the other sense too, where it's almost, it's okay. So like I'm someone who in day-to-day life, like something not planned will happen to me and I'll go, huh, okay, c'est la vie, and then like move on. And it's very much that, where it's like a bad thing can happen and you can choose to be like, this is changing everything for the negative, and now like everything's going to be worse because of this. Or, okay, so it goes, let's carry on. And, you know, not necessarily that things will be better, but that they can carry on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I find interesting too is whenever someone dies that you know is going to die earlier in the narrative, and you hear the So It Goes, I feel like it's meant to reflect what you're thinking. Like Derby, that high school teacher, you're told right off the bat he's going to be killed by firing squad for stealing a teapot. And they keep referring to him as poor Derby, Derby who's going to die soon. And so when he does die, it's sort of like, well, that was going to happen. And it sort of, I guess, makes you think the way someone in war might. Like, well, someone was going to die and it was probably going to be him. So it goes.
Yeah, it's a very interesting device. I was pleasantly surprised, because I think some reviews that skewed toward my rating were like really annoyed by how heavily So It Goes was used, and I actually found that it didn't really bother me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. I think it was another example for me of like, this book does a lot of things that I often find like annoying or pretentious, but it does them with more effectiveness. Like it does them with more like genuine skill. And so yeah, they don't irritate me. Like I said at the beginning of the live show, I think that the disjointed narrative and like all of the like, I can't tell a story in a linear way, I'm too smart for that. Like I think a lot of times that can be, it can like be so annoying to read that it outweighs any benefit to the story. And this is one of the only books where I'm like, no, I genuinely think it did add to what this book was doing and what it was saying. So yeah, I agree, Julia. I think the usage of So It Goes was actually very well handled and like intentional.
So, well, I guess we could talk about the significance of the bird cry. It was something I hadn't really thought about. So I had to do some reading up on it. Which is also where I found the questions about, do you think Kurt Vonnegut was high? But I believe the book, I don't know if it starts with it, but
it's like, I think at the beginning of the introduction, or at the end of the introduction, I mean.
Yeah.
Pretty wheat.
I have no thoughts on the bird. I'll let you guys take this one.
Oh, I have zero thoughts on the bird. In fact, the bird to me, I was like, this is part of the absurdism. This is a
Right,
part
that's
of like
what
the whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So looking online, there seems to be a consensus among scholars that the bird sound is, I guess, maybe used more than we think. I only saw it, I think, the 2 times, but it's meant to be when something is so horrible it cannot be described, which interesting. I just threw that on there because I wasn't sure if anyone else had any thoughts, but I thought that was interesting that that was the consensus.
No. I guess now I'm curious to know, where did we miss it within the book, right?
Yeah.
Seems like it probably would have to have been after the bombing.
Yeah. But I probably just didn't pay attention to it.
I'm
But
sure I caught it and I was like, there's that dang bird again. I didn't think a dang thing about it.
yeah, I wonder if it is there more often because, Julia, your copy of the book does have a bird on the back.
Tweet tweet. I mean, pooty tweet. What kind of bird makes that sound, by the way? Like, genuinely.
An
I don't
alien
know.
bird.
Whoa.
Plot twist.
Parliamentarian bird.
So I wanted to see if there was anything else you guys wanted to discuss. There was one thing that, like, I started thinking about while we were talking. And I'm going to not even really describe it well, but something that I found interesting was that Billy's son is a Green Beret in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Sure is.
Yeah, and I don't know if it was on purpose that we don't see much of his son, but I did think it was interesting that that cycle seems like it's going to continue, especially, I mean, I don't think Kurt had any way of knowing this, but we at least know how bad PTSD or how prevalent it was after the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
With vets.
And the, like, most of this book story obviously deals with World War II rather than Vietnam, but I think it's really interesting that even in just the couple of, like, offhand mentions, it definitely sounds like Kurt Vonnegut is already criticizing the Vietnam War. Like, even the way, like, when he like offhandedly says how many soldiers on both sides died defending this one hill that, like, didn't even matter, you know, or that, like, they didn't even keep the territory and stuff. So, like, just those little mentions, I think that's one of the things that it's like, okay, yeah, this does feel like an anti-war novel. I think there's a lot of stuff that distracts from that.
Yeah.
But
yeah, it was just something I found interesting. Yeah, that's all I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, because this book was published, like, at the tail end of the war.
Yeah.
I had to look. I was like, I don't know what years wars began.
Yeah. And I mean, I think people universally acknowledge that the Vietnam War was just such a senseless war, whereas with World War II, you could argue that, like, well, one, Japan attacked us first, and then the Holocaust was happening, although Americans were not as upset about that as they should have been.
No, they really were not. Yeah.
What a wild thing to learn.
Yeah.
But we do know for a fact that the Vietnam War just isn't meant to happen, and it is such a waste, honestly.
Yeah.
So I think the mention of that in this book was very interesting, and, like, what few mentions we get, like you said, Cara, like fighting over a hill, like, it seems like even more of a senseless waste.
Yeah, and I think going back to something you were saying, Taylor, and that we also talked about earlier, is I think it's very intentional and very interesting that even though the book does not at all mince words about the people in the war who were horrible and who were just outright, you know, doing these disgusting, despicable things, like the German, like, prison wardens and all of that, like, the book does not at all soften what they're doing, but it also doesn't let the Allies get away with, like, oh, they firebombed a civilian city. It was full of, like, women and children. It was full of, like, nurses and, like, volunteers, you know, like, they very intentionally are like, hey, you know what gets people like really upset and like, you know, gets them like, it really breaks their spirit is if we attack non-combatants. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's another thing that like makes this book a more effective anti-war story, in spite of the other things that it has going on too, is that like he's not like giving you an easy out. Like when the commanders are saying like, well, but look at all these people's lives we saved, he's like, that might be true. I'm not even saying you made the wrong call. I'm saying look at what you did, and
Yeah.
like admit it, you know, and acknowledge it. And yeah, like just I think that that was one of the parts where like the emotion did come through in the book, like in the themes more than in like the individual characters.
Yeah. It also, like, the way people were brushing it off, sort of like, well, it had to happen.
Yes,
It was
exactly.
like, what else are we supposed to do? It had to happen. We had to end the
And it
war.
did not. Yeah.
Which, like, I know a lot of people use when they talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And, like, it's like we're not going to discuss it anymore. We just had no choice. We just had to do it. And it's
Yeah.
like, I understand the situations are complex, but we could talk about it some more.
Yeah, exactly. I read a children's book about Hiroshima, and it was set like a couple decades after, and it's so short, but it is one of the most, I think, effective and has like the most like impact, where it's like that is exactly what I think what we should feel is that like we're not saying that a better option would have been to keep fighting like we were and to let, you know, the Nazis keep doing what they were doing. Like it's not about that. It's not about like which is the right decision. Make that decision. Don't ever feel bad about it. It's like you have to like acknowledge what you have done and stop trying to like excuse yourself basically by saying that like, oh, it was a military necessity. And I think that that is really interesting contrasted with the aliens in the book, where it's like, oh, it had to happen this way. It's inevitable. And it's like their way of saying it, of course, is nonsensical because they're aliens and they're so different. Whereas like on Earth, it's the people who are in charge of these like military maneuvers who are like, oh, it had to happen this way. And it's like, that is also nonsensical.
Yeah. I'm taking a so it goes approach to it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
But unless there's anything else you want to discuss, guys, we can move into quotes.
Yeah. The one I've been looking forward to.
I'm like disappointed in myself because like there were a lot of effective moments, but I just didn't think about saving them except for a couple. So I've only got like 2.
Well, I can start. I've got one. This is actually from the introduction section, when they're with like the children and he's visiting his friend or whatever. We went to the New York World's Fair, saw what the past had been like, according to the Ford Motor Car Company and Walt Disney, saw what the future would be like, according to General Motors. And I asked myself about the present, how wide it was, how deep it was, how much was mine to keep.
I had that one tabbed too.
There's so many good ones.
There's one later, still in the introduction, that we are supposed to assume is Kurt Vonnegut writing. And Lot's wife, of course, was told not to look back, where all those people and their homes had been. But she did look back, and I love her for that, because it was so human. So she was turned into a pillar of salt. So it goes. But
Yes.
just that, like,
Taylor, I don't know if you could hear it, but Cara and I both went, yeah!
It's just like, I don't know, something about loving this woman in the Bible that's sort of like seen as foolish when she did something that was so incredibly human.
I know.
Yeah.
I wish the rest of the book was more like that.
Yeah. The way that it gave like the context of the story and like, yeah, in so few words, like, yeah, it's a really good part. One of my favorites is from near the end. It's when Billy's in the hospital next to that really awful old man. Nobody took Rumford's diagnosis seriously. The staff thought Rumford was a hateful old man, conceited and cruel. He often said to them, in one way or another, that people who were weak deserved to die, whereas the staff, of course, was devoted to the idea that weak people should be helped as much as possible, that nobody should die.
That guy was awful.
Yeah.
He really was. And then right after that, there in the hospital, Billy was having an adventure very common among people without power in time of war. He was trying to prove to a willfully deaf and blind enemy that he was interesting to hear and see. Like, I think, again, like, that speaks to the dehumanizing of soldiers in war, so.
I have this line from early in the book when it's probably when we're first getting introduced to the Tralfamadorians, and I just like the way it's phrased. It's like learning about their philosophy on time. All moments, past, present, and future, always have existed, always will exist. The Tralfamadorians can look at all the different moments just the way we can look at a stretch of the Rocky Mountains, for instance. They can see how permanent all the moments are, and they can look at any moment that interests them. It is just an illusion we have here on Earth that one moment follows another one, like beads on a string, and that once a moment is gone, it is gone forever.
I love that.
My only other one that I actually saved, you guys were talking about, like, the nobody's like a character in war, and I found that part. It was the other one that I saved. And then it develops that Campbell was not going to go unanswered after all. Poor old Derby, the doomed high school teacher, lumbered to his feet for what was probably the finest moment in his life. There are almost no characters in this story, and almost no dramatic confrontations, because most of the people in it are so sick, and so much the listless playthings of enormous forces. One of the main effects of war, after all, is that people are discouraged from being characters. But old Derby was a character now. His stance was that of a punch-drunk fighter. His head was down. His fists were out front, waiting for information and battle plan. Derby raised his head, called Campbell a snake. He corrected that. He said that snakes couldn't help being snakes, and that Campbell, who could help being what he was something much lower than a snake or a rat, or even a blood-filled tick. So good. And I think that's like, you know, one of the things that I feel like we keep coming back to with the book is, like, responsibility, you know, and how, like, one of the downsides of, you know, so it goes, just accept it. Everything has happened this way and that you can't change it. One of the counter arguments to that is, like, no, like, you are responsible for your choices. You are responsible for what you do in this world. And I really, really like that he, like, starts to compare him to all these, like, disgusting animals. And he's like, oh, wait, no, it's not their fault. You chose to be this way. Like, I feel like that's very, like, what a great burn. And also just, like, very indicative of, like, the book as a whole. So
yeah. A tick is just born a tick, but you're a bloodsucker on purpose.
Exactly. Exactly.
So one that I thought was very interesting in terms of the Tralfamadorians is the part when they mentioned that there are 5 sexes on Tralfamador.
Yeah.
And it says here, the Tralfamadorians tried to give Billy clues that would help him imagine sex in the invisible dimension. They told him that there could be no earthling babies without male homosexuals, there could be babies without female homosexuals, there couldn't be babies without women over 65 years old, there could be babies without men over 65, there couldn't be babies without other babies who had lived an hour or less after birth, and so on. It was gibberish to Billy. I just thought that was, like, really interesting.
It is interesting.
I don't think it says anything about the larger picture of the book as a whole, but I thought, like, oh, a little bit of world building.
Yeah. I want to share a moment that is not because of the writing, but because I genuinely thought it was the funniest moment in the whole book. And it's when Billy is really super drunk. The main thing now was to find the steering wheel. At first, Billy windmilled his arms, hoping to find it by luck. When that didn't work, he became methodical, working in such a way that the wheel could not possibly escape him. He placed himself hard against the left-hand door, searched every square inch of the area before him. When he failed to find the wheel, he moved over 6 inches and searched again. Amazingly, he was eventually hard right against the right-hand door without having found the wheel. He concluded that somebody had stolen it. This angered him as he passed out. He was in the back seat of his car, which is why he couldn't find the steering wheel. I love that so much.
The image of him like windmilling his arms is so funny.
And also when it describes how methodical he is, I picture him like with his face like almost against the seat, and he's like,
yeah. The note that I wrote to remind myself of that was, nothing could so perfectly describe the experience of being absolutely plastered as failing to find your steering wheel, indignantly concluding someone must have stolen it, and passing out not realizing you're in the backseat of the car. Because I just think like that the whole experience.
There were a couple of really, really funny moments. One of the ones, so like the person who said it was awful. He was the little skinny guy who was like, I can have anybody murdered at any time. I do it all the time.
Oh,
like,
Lazaro.
Lazaro, yeah. So he was the worst. He was awful. But
yeah,
isn't it he who says at one point, he says something like, take a like fucking a donut, like a rolling donut or something. It was so bizarre. Out of nowhere. I did not save the quote. Perhaps I should have.
No,
it did leave an impression, but something about a rolling donut, and he was what a time.
So I have one that's a bit long. But they're talking about The Gospel from Outer Space by Kilgore Trout. It was about a visitor from outer space, shaped very much like a Trifalmadorian, by the way. The visitor from outer space made a serious study of Christianity to learn, if he could, why Christians found it so easy to be cruel. He concluded that at least part of the trouble was slipshod storytelling in the New Testament. He supposed that the intent of the Gospels was to teach people, among other things, to be merciful, even to the lowest of the low. But the Gospels actually taught this. Before you kill somebody, make absolutely sure he isn't well connected. So it goes. The flaw in the Christ stories, said the visitor from outer space, was that Christ, who didn't look like much, was actually the son of the most powerful being in the universe. Readers understood that, so when they came to the crucifixion, they naturally thought, and Rosewater read out loud again, oh boy, they sure picked the wrong guy to lynch that time, and that thought had a brother. There are right people to lynch? Who? People not well connected. So it goes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah. That's one of my favorite parts. Like, and also like solid theology as well. Like when he's like describing like, so the right way to do it would be that Jesus is just some little nobody who was never claimed by God, and that's just like, that isn't part of his life, of what happens. And then when he gets crucified, God's like, no. And then everybody's like, oh, I guess we shouldn't do this to anybody.
I just like, so wait, there are right people to lynch?
Exactly. Yeah.
No, genuinely.
Or the part, see, this is another one. It's like, why didn't I like take a screenshot of this quote? I don't know. I think I was just like in the reading mode.
You were in the zone.
In the zone, yeah. When he's talking about watching the war reel backwards.
Oh, I have that next.
Okay. Yeah, and go ahead.
This is like the latter half of it, but when the bombers got back to their base, the steel cylinders were taken from the racks and shipped back to the United States of America, where factories were operating night and day, dismantling the cylinders, separating the dangerous contents into minerals. Touchingly, it was mainly women who did this work. The minerals were then shipped to specialists in remote areas. It was their business to put them into the ground, to hide them cleverly so they would never hurt anybody ever again.
Yeah. That was really good.
There's like little like scenes or moments like that just are so good. It's like I want more of the book to lean into this, but
yeah. I liked this line as well. This is when Billy is in the hospital, ? And his mother's visiting him. She upset Billy simply by being his mother. She made him feel embarrassed and ungrateful and weak because she had gone to so much trouble to give him life and to keep that life going, and Billy didn't really like life at all.
Yeah.
That
part was really sad.
Yeah.
There is this part later when that rude guy at the hospital is talking about to his like 23-year-old girlfriend.
Oh my god, yeah.
He can't read.
Who apparently what?
She can't read, apparently.
Yeah, okay. It's like,
But he was talking about the bombing of Dresden in World War II, and that's the only time Billy speaks up. He's like, I was there. You're a liar.
yeah.
Yeah, I actually have a line about him as well. Rumford was thinking in a very military manner that an inconvenient person, one whose death he wished for very much for practical reasons, was suffering from a repulsive disease.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, if you're standing in the way of what I want, yeah, you must be sick.
Yeah. And also the way that like he didn't like what Billy was saying. It complicated what he believed and what he wanted to think. And so his response was like, there's something wrong with you. There must be something wrong with you. And if I can convince other people of that, it means that I don't have to listen to what you say. And I'm like, commentary in this book is solid.
There is one about Vietnam, which I believe is like a flash forward to Billy speaking at the Lions Club, where they have like a visitor from the Marines. The speaker at the Lions Club meeting was a major in the Marines. He said that Americans had no choice but to keep fighting in Vietnam until they achieved victory or until the communists realized that they could not force their way of life on weak countries. The major had been there on 2 separate tours of duty. He told of many terrible and many wonderful things he had seen. He was in favor of increased bombing North Vietnam back to the Stone Age if it refused to see reason. Billy was not moved to protest the bombings of North Vietnam, did not shudder about the hideous things he himself had seen bombing do. He was simply having lunch with the Lions Club, of which he was past president now.
Yeah. I have my ebook open now, and I just found the part about capitalism in the US specifically. And again, the person saying this is a Nazi, so his other beliefs are horrible. But I think that this was a way for Kurt Vonnegut to sort of like get at the wealth inequality discussion from like an outside perspective. He's like, I'm not saying this, this other person is saying. America is the wealthiest nation on earth, but its people are mainly poor, and poor Americans are urged to hate themselves. To quote the American humorist Ken Hubbard, it ain't no disgrace to be poor, but it might as well be. It is in fact a crime for an American to be poor, even though America is a nation of poor. Every other nation has folk traditions of men who were poor, but extremely wise and virtuous, and therefore more estimable than anyone with power and gold. No such tales are told by the American poor. They mock themselves and glorify their betters. The meanest eating or drinking establishment, owned by a man who is himself poor, is very likely to have a sign on its wall asking this cruel question: if you're so smart, why ain't you rich? There will also be an American flag, no larger than a child's hand, glued to a lollipop stick and flying from the cash register. Yeah. And then, let's see, right after that. Oh, yeah, they say the author of the monograph, a native of Schenectady, New York, was said by some to have had the highest IQ of all the war criminals who were made to face a death by hanging. So it goes. It goes right into the other part of the money discussion. Americans, like human beings everywhere, believe many things that are obviously untrue, the monograph went on. Their most destructive untruth is that it is very easy for any American to make money. They will not acknowledge how, in fact, hard money is to come by, and therefore those who have no money blame and blame and blame themselves. This inward blame has been a treasure for the rich and powerful, who have had to do less for their poor, publicly and privately, than any other ruling class since, say, Napoleonic times.
Those paragraphs were like too real.
They were like, yeah, it's like, wow, not much has changed.
Well, so much of that, like, I think about the pull yourself up by your own bootstraps mentality, yes. Where like you don't have money, but you need money to move up, but you got to do it somehow, otherwise you're just lazy.
Yeah.
According to.
Yeah, and like there are parts of what he says about like one of the things he argues is that poor people don't love each other because they don't love themselves, and it's like obviously that's not true. Like people who are not wealthy tend to be the people who give the most. Like they keep finding that data. But yeah, like so much of what he's like, even like the American flag, the little American flag, like with the lollipop at the cash register, and it's like the way that he captures like the weird mix of patriotism and capitalism is so on point. Like frighteningly accurate. And I would also argue, and I don't think he touches on this, but like I think too that the rich have also convinced themselves that it's easy to make money. Like I think it started out as trying to convince poor people, but I think now they also believe it. And people who are well off, it's like if they acknowledge that it is not easy to make money, it is not easy to escape poverty, then they would have to accept, like with themselves, that it could happen to them one day, and they don't want to do that. So
and they think it takes away something from them too, like, oh, they're saying I didn't work hard and stuff like that. And no one's saying that maybe someone who was born into money and then got richer didn't work hard, but they had so many legs up that other people would have to work 10 times harder to achieve.
Yeah, it's like we're not saying you didn't work to like start your business or like anything. We're saying like you didn't have to worry about eating while you were doing this, you know?
It's like when you hear about like CEOs starting like something in their basement and then they like neglect to tell you that they started off with like $100,000 investment from their parents.
Right. A small $1 million loan.
Well, for centuries now, right? Like America has like been like, oh, it's the American dream. You just show up with whatever you own, the shirt off on your back, and then you can make it in this new world. And it's like, if people don't do that, then it's like, well, it's this moral failing. Like, what did you do wrong that you're not a billionaire?
Yeah. Even the part where it's like there is no like American folk tradition that valorizes poor people, and I'm like, holy shit, that's true. Like, there's like it's always in the way that, like, yes, there always has to be riches at the end of it, or they're not a hero. And it's like you think in other fairy tales, it's like like the poor beggar might end up becoming the king, but it's not so much about the wealth, even though that's obviously part of it. It's like, oh, he's the proper person to be in charge because he's virtuous, you know, so he should be king. Yeah, it's just like, man.
And then with us, either they're completely separate from any sort of economic system. I'm thinking of like Paul Bunyan.
Yes.
Who, like,
Paul Bunyan, the capitalist icon.
I assume Paul Bunyan stays away from the economy.
Well, I feel like you can make an argument for like Johnny Appleseed. I feel like he's an entrepreneur. You know, he's got the orchards. No, make your point. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I think that what you were saying was really interesting, Cara, and what the book says about that we don't have these folk tales that involve virtuous, you know, poor people that remain.
Like virtuous poor people are not really believed to exist unless it's on their road to becoming rich people. Wild.
Yeah.
Yeah. Much to think about.
So unless you guys have anything else you want to discuss, we can reveal what our next book is. Cara?
Yes, so it is going to be Blood in the Mist by Hope Merlees. I have a beautiful copy somewhere, and of course it's not next to me. But I am really excited. It's going to be a reread for me, but I've only read it once before, and it was a long time ago, and I remember almost nothing. So this will be a fun little experiment. And also, it is a fantasy novel written by a woman that was published before Lord of the Rings. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, pre-Tolkien fantasy by a lady. And I remember it being this like really interesting mix of like cozy fairy tale, but also like really creepy in some parts. So I think it'll be a fun one to discuss. And I don't think it's especially long, if I'm remembering correctly.
My copy doesn't look too chunky. So.
Yeah. So I'm really looking forward to like reading and discussing, because as I said, I don't remember much about it at all, just that I liked it. So
Well, now you definitely have me intrigued.
Yeah,
I didn't know anything about this book. I've never heard of it, but I heard fantasy written by a woman.
yeah.
I
And
feel like my
think,
copy has a blurb on it by someone that I like, and I can't remember who it is. So
yeah. And I think it sort of is one of those like old world kind of fair folk stories. Like there are parts of it like that, which kind of speaks to like, oh, fairy tale vibes, but also this is incredibly disturbing. Are you sure this is for children? So that'll be fun.
Hey. So that'll be we'll announce it hopefully before the end of the month, but we'll see.
speaking of which, we are now officially caught up with what we said we were going to read last year. So we will probably share on Instagram like the next batch of books that
and
are in the near future.
I'll do a video announcement too, like I usually do. So that'll be very exciting. I'll be sure to prioritize that. But yeah, I'm really glad you picked this one, Taylor, because like I absolutely, this is one of the books on our list that I can definitively say I never would have read it if not for the book club. And even though I didn't completely love it, I enjoyed it so much more than I thought. And like there are things in this book that I think I'm going to think about like forever. So
yes, I do think it's going to be one of those books. Sorry, I was going to compare it in a way that probably wasn't very flattering, but it's going to be a book.
Well, now I'm curious.
Like there are some books that I give like 2.5 to 3.5 stars where I'm like, objectively, this is not my favorite book, but just live in my mind rent free. And there will be parts of this book that I think about often.
Yeah. It's your Lord of the Flies.
So it goes.
What was that, Julia?
I said, I will be saying so it goes sometimes.
There you go.
So it goes is like the older version of it do be like that sometimes.
Oh my gosh, now I'm picturing like a modern slang version of Slaughterhouse-Five where all the so it goes is it do be like that.
But thank you so much, Cara and Julia, for joining me today. And thank you so much to everyone who tuned in. And we will see you in our next stream.
Yeah. Bye.